This is the story of how one nation fought a war so catastrophic that 150 years later, it still has not recovered, and how that war killed so many men that the country had to legalize polygamy just to survive. The year is 1864. Paraguay, a small landlocked nation in South America, goes to war against three of its neighbors simultaneously: Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. The War of the Triple Alliance has begun. By 1870, when the war finally ends, Paraguay's population has been reduced from approximately 525,000 to 221,000. More than half the nation is dead. But the demographic catastrophe is even worse than that number suggests. Of the survivors, the vast majority are women and children. Somewhere between 80% and 90% of Paraguay's adult male population is dead. In some regions, women outnumber men 20 to 1. The nation's gender ratio is so skewed that Paraguay legalizes polygamy. One man can marry multiple women because there are simply not enough men left to form traditional families. Today, 150 years later, Paraguay remains one of the poorest nations in South America. Its economy never fully recovered. Its population never fully recovered. The War of the Triple Alliance destroyed Paraguay so completely that the nation has spent a century and a half trying to rebuild, and still hasn't succeeded. By the end of this video, you will understand how a single war can permanently cripple a nation, how demographic collapse creates economic collapse, how losing 90% of your male population eliminates the workforce, destroys productivity, and traps a country in poverty for generations, and why the most devastating wars are not always the most famous. Paraguay, in 1864, is a small, landlocked nation in the heart of South America. It is bordered by Argentina to the south, Brazil to the north and east, and Bolivia to the northwest. It has no access to the ocean. All trade must pass through neighboring countries. Despite these geographic constraints, Paraguay is relatively prosperous in the mid-1800s. Under the leadership of the Lopez family, first Carlos Antonio Lopez, then his son Francisco Solano Lopez, Paraguay has developed a strong centralized economy and a powerful military for its size. Paraguay's economy is state-controlled. The government owns major industries. Foreign debt is minimal. The nation is self-sufficient in many ways. Compared to other South American nations plagued by civil wars and economic instability, Paraguay appears stable and organized. But this stability creates tension with neighbors. Paraguay's authoritarian government and protectionist economic policies clash with the liberal, free trade ideologies of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Regional politics in the 1860s are volatile. Alliances shift, border disputes simmer, and Francisco Solano Lopez, Paraguay's leader, is ambitious. Lopez believes Paraguay should be a major regional power. He builds up Paraguay's military, creating what is, relative to population, one of the most militarized states in South America. He involves Paraguay in the civil conflicts of neighboring nations. He makes strategic miscalculations about alliances and power dynamics. In 1864, these miscalculations lead to disaster. A complex series of events, Brazilian intervention in Uruguay, Paraguay, and demands for passage through Argentine territory to intervene. Argentine refusal escalates into war. Paraguay finds itself fighting Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay simultaneously. This is military suicide. Paraguay's population is approximately 525,000. Brazil's population is over 10 million. Argentina's is over 1.7 million. Even Uruguay, the smallest member of the Triple Alliance, has more people than Paraguay. The population disparity translates directly into military disparity. Paraguay can field perhaps 60,000 to 80,000 soldiers initially, nearly its entire adult male population mobilized. The Triple Alliance can field hundreds of thousands with reserves to replace casualties. Paraguay is outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. There is no rational scenario where Paraguay wins this war, but Lopez commits Paraguay to fight anyway. The War of the Triple Alliance begins in 1864 with early Paraguayan offensives. Lopez invades Brazilian territory and Argentine territory, hoping to strike quickly before the alliance can fully mobilize. The initial attacks achieve some tactical successes, but fail strategically. By 1865, the Triple Alliance has organized. Brazilian, Argentine, and Uruguayan forces begin coordinated invasions of Paraguay. The Paraguayan military fights with desperate determination but is steadily pushed back. The war becomes a grinding war of attrition. Paraguay cannot replace its losses. Every soldier who dies is irreplaceable. The alliance can bring in fresh troops continuously. Paraguay bleeds men it cannot afford to lose. As casualties mount, Paraguay mobilizes every available male. Teenagers are conscripted. Old men are conscripted. Boys as young as 10 are armed and sent to fight. By the later years of the war, the Paraguayan army includes children carrying weapons too large for them to handle properly. The alliance advances relentlessly. Paraguayan defenses are overwhelmed by superior numbers. Cities fall, territory is occupied. By 1869, Paraguay's capital, Asunción, is captured. Lopez retreats into the interior with the remnants of his forces. But Lopez refuses to surrender. Even as his nation collapses around him, even as his army is reduced to starving boys and old men, Lopez continues fighting. He orders a scorched earth policy. He executes officials he suspects of disloyalty. He leads Paraguay deeper into catastrophe. The war finally ends in March 1870 when Lopez is killed in battle by Brazilian forces. With Lopez dead and organized resistance impossible, Paraguay surrenders. The War of the Triple Alliance is over. Paraguay has been utterly destroyed. The population statistics are staggering. Before the war, Paraguay's population was approximately 525,000. After the war, estimates range from 221,000 to 300,000 survivors. Even taking the higher estimate, over 40% of the population is dead. But the demographic catastrophe is concentrated in adult males. Men fought, men died. Women and children, while also suffering from disease, starvation, and violence, survived in far greater numbers. Estimates suggest that 60 to 70% of Paraguay's total population died, but among adult males, the death rate was 80 to 90%. In some regions, the ratio of women to men was 20 to 1 or higher. Entire towns had no adult men left alive. This gender imbalance created immediate practical problems. Who would farm the land? Who would rebuild destroyed infrastructure? Who would repopulate the nation? Paraguay had women, children, and old men, but the working-age male population that forms the backbone of any agricultural economy was almost entirely gone. The post-war Paraguayan government faced an unprecedented situation. They needed to rebuild a nation with a catastrophically skewed gender ratio. Traditional family structures, one man, one woman, were impossible when women outnumbered men by massive margins. The solution was controversial but pragmatic. Paraguay legalized polygamy. A man could marry multiple women. This was not based on ideology or religion. This was demographic necessity. With so few men, monogamy meant most women would never marry, never have children, never form families. Polygamy allowed the few surviving men to father children with multiple women. It was a conscious policy to repopulate the nation as quickly as possible. The alternative, waiting for the population to recover naturally through monogamous marriages, would take generations. This policy reveals how desperate Paraguay's situation was. The nation was willing to overturn fundamental social structures because the alternative was demographic extinction. Paraguay needed children. It needed a next generation. And with 90% of men dead, traditional marriage could not provide that. The economic consequences of losing 90% of adult males were immediate and catastrophic. Paraguay's economy in the 1860s was primarily agricultural. Farming requires labor, human labor, in an era before mechanization. With most men dead, there was no workforce. Fields could not be plowed, crops could not be harvested, infrastructure could not be rebuilt. The women and children who survived could perform some labor, but they could not replace the lost male workforce entirely. Agricultural production collapsed. Food shortages continued after the war. The economy, already destroyed by years of warfare, could not recover because there were not enough workers to produce goods. The war also destroyed Paraguay's infrastructure. Cities were damaged or destroyed. Roads and bridges were ruined. Government institutions collapsed. The physical capital of the nation was gone, and there was no labor force to rebuild it. Paraguay also lost territory. Brazil and Argentina annexed significant portions of Paraguayan land in the peace settlement. Paraguay went from being a mid-sized South American nation to a smaller, weaker, poorer state surrounded by the countries that had just destroyed it. The combination of demographic collapse, economic destruction, territorial loss, and lack of labor force created a poverty trap. Paraguay could not rebuild because it lacked the people and resources to rebuild, and because it could not rebuild, it remained poor, which prevented recovery. In the 150 years since the war, Paraguay has never fully recovered. It remains one of the poorest nations in South America. Its GDP per capita is lower than Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. Its development indicators lag behind its neighbors. The demographic effects persist. While Paraguay's population has grown since 1870, It now has approximately 7 million people. The war created a generational setback. The population that should have existed, the children and grandchildren of the men who died, never existed. Economically, Paraguay missed the economic growth periods that other South American nations experienced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While Argentina and Brazil industrialized and developed, Paraguay was still struggling to rebuild from the war. The war also traumatized Paraguayan national identity. The memory of the war, the catastrophic defeat, the demographic collapse, the national humiliation, shapes how Paraguay sees itself. The War of the Triple Alliance is a defining event in Paraguayan history, taught in schools, memorialized in monuments, embedded in national consciousness. Modern Paraguay is democratic and stable, but it remains economically disadvantaged. The war's long-term effects, lack of development, infrastructure deficits, economic dependency on neighbors, continue to constrain Paraguayan growth. The War of the Triple Alliance teaches several lessons about how wars create permanent damage. The most obvious lesson is about demographic collapse. Losing 90% of adult males is not just a tragedy, it is an economic catastrophe. In agricultural economies, labor is wealth. Removing the workforce removes the capacity to produce. Paraguay after 1870 had land, but no one to farm it. It had potential resources, but no one to extract them. Demographic collapse caused economic collapse. This effect compounds over generations. The men who died in 1864 to 1870 never had children. Those unborn children never had children. The demographic hole created by the war propagated through time. Paraguay's population today is smaller than it would have been if the war had never happened. The war also demonstrates how military miscalculation leads to national destruction. Francisco Solano Lopez chose to fight a war. Paraguay could not win. The population disparity made defeat inevitable. But Lopez fought anyway, and his refusal to surrender extended the war long after it was clear Paraguay would lose. This stubbornness killed hundreds of thousands. If Paraguay had surrendered in 1866 or 1867, when defeat was already certain, tens of thousands of lives could have been saved. But Lopez's personal pride and authoritarian control meant the war continued until he was killed. The war also reveals how wars fought to the bitter end cause maximum destruction. The final years of the War of the Triple Alliance were the most destructive. By 1868 to 1870, Paraguay was already defeated. But Lopez kept fighting, and the alliance kept killing until almost no men were left. Compare this to other wars where negotiated settlements occurred before total destruction. When one side surrenders before complete annihilation, populations survive, economies can rebuild, recovery is possible. But when wars continue until one side is literally unable to fight, as happened to Paraguay, the destruction is total. The War of the Triple Alliance is also a case study in how power imbalances make wars catastrophic. Paraguay was massively outmatched. It should never have fought this war. But it did, and the predictable result was annihilation. Small nations picking fights with larger neighbors almost always lose. But the degree of loss varies. If Paraguay had fought a limited war, accepted early defeat, and negotiated terms, it might have lost territory but survived as a nation. Instead, it fought to total exhaustion and nearly ceased to exist. Modern Paraguay still lives with the consequences: the economic underdevelopment, the territorial losses, the demographic setback. All trace back to 1864 to 1870. One war, 6 years long, created effects that last 150 years and counting. The War of the Triple Alliance is not unique in causing long-term damage. Many wars create generational effects. World War I's demographic impact on European populations lasted decades. World War II's destruction of European and Asian infrastructure took generations to rebuild. But the War of the Triple Alliance is extreme. Few wars kill 60 to 70% of a nation's population. Few wars eliminate 90% of adult males. Few wars create demographic collapses so severe that polygamy becomes state policy. The war is also a reminder that the most devastating wars are not always the most famous. The War of the Triple Alliance killed hundreds of thousands and destroyed a nation. But it is barely known outside South America. It does not appear in most world history courses. Its catastrophic scale is forgotten. This obscurity means the lessons are not learned. The war demonstrates how demographic collapse creates permanent poverty, how military miscalculation destroys nations, how fighting unwinnable wars is national suicide. But these lessons are ignored because the war itself is forgotten. Paraguay's experience also shows how nations can survive catastrophic wars but never recover. Paraguay still exists. It has a government, an economy, a population, but it is not the nation it could have been without the war. The war permanently altered Paraguay's trajectory. This raises questions about recovery. What does recovery mean when 90% of your men are dead? Paraguay rebuilt, but it rebuilt as a poorer, weaker, smaller nation than it was before. Is that recovery, or is that just survival? The war also demonstrates how authoritarian leadership can trap nations in catastrophic decisions. Lopez had absolute power. He chose war. He refused surrender, and ordinary Paraguayans had no way to stop him. They died in hundreds of thousands because one man's pride and ambition mattered more than their lives. Democratic nations have mechanisms, elections, opposition parties, free press, that can constrain leaders who make catastrophic decisions. Authoritarian nations lack these safeguards. When an authoritarian leader commits to a suicidal war, the nation follows him to destruction. The post-war legalization of polygamy is itself a fascinating historical detail. It shows how desperate circumstances force societies to abandon traditional structures. Polygamy is not a Paraguayan cultural tradition. It was emergency policy. This pragmatism saved Paraguay from demographic extinction. By allowing men to have multiple wives, Paraguay increased birth rates faster than monogamy would have allowed. The policy was temporary. As the gender ratio normalized over generations, Paraguay returned to monogamy, but for a crucial period, it was necessary. This adaptability contrasts with Lopez's inflexibility during the war. Paraguay's post-war government was pragmatic, willing to try unorthodox solutions to unprecedented problems. Lopez was rigid, refusing to surrender even as his nation died. The difference in outcomes is stark. Pragmatism allowed recovery. Rigidity caused catastrophe. The War of the Triple Alliance is a story of choices and consequences. Paraguay chose war. Lopez chose to continue fighting. The Triple Alliance chose total destruction rather than negotiated peace. Each choice had consequences that echo 150 years later. Those consequences are measurable. Paraguay's GDP per capita is lower than it would have been. Its population is smaller, its territory is reduced, its development is delayed. The war's effects are not theoretical, they are visible in every economic statistic, every demographic chart, every comparison with neighbors. The war is also a reminder that nations are fragile. Paraguay before 1864 was stable and relatively prosperous. 6 years later, it was destroyed. The transition from functioning nation to demographic catastrophe took less than a decade. This fragility means choices matter enormously. The decision to go to war, the decision to surrender or fight on, the decision to accept peace terms or demand total victory. Each choice can determine whether a nation survives or is destroyed. Paraguay made the wrong choices. It fought a war it could not win. Its leader refused to surrender when surrender could have saved lives, and the nation paid a price that persists 150 years later. The survivors rebuilt. They legalized polygamy. They had children. They slowly, painfully reconstructed a nation from ruins, but they could not undo the damage. They could not bring back the dead. They could not restore what was lost. Today, Paraguay is a democracy. It is peaceful. It is stable, but it is also poor. It is still recovering from a war that ended in 1870, and that fact, that 150 years later, the effects still persist, is perhaps the most important lesson. Wars end, treaties are signed, soldiers go home or are buried, but the consequences continue. Demographic collapse creates economic collapse. Economic collapse creates poverty. Poverty persists across generations, and 150 years later, the nation that lost 90% of its men is still trying to recover. The War of the Triple Alliance killed more than 300,000 Paraguayans. It eliminated 90% of adult males. It forced Paraguay to legalize polygamy. It reduced the nation to ruins. And 150 years later, Paraguay, a nation that once fought 3 neighbors simultaneously, remains one of South America's poorest countries, still living with the consequences of a war it should never have fought. The men who died cannot come back. The children they never had do not exist. The economy they would have built was never built. And Paraguay, despite 150 years of effort, has still not recovered. This is what total war does. This is what fighting to the bitter end costs. This is what happens when a nation loses 90% of its men. Paraguay lost a war in 1870, but it is still losing 150 years later. And that is the real catastrophe. Not just that the war happened, but that it never truly ended.